Martin Alcott thought he was chasing history. The three college girls believed they were only capturing photographs. And the wealthy man who bought the chapel believed he could turn ruins into a museum. None of them realized they were walking into the same place, the Holy House of Horror, a place where every visitor leaves behind more questions than answers, and where some never leave at all. ChatGPT said, at the far end of town, past the quiet rows of houses and the fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, stood a mansion that had once been a place of prayer and devotion. St. Alora's Chapel had been built more than a century ago, its walls thick with stone and its windows glowing with stained glass that told the stories of saints and angels. For years, it had been the heart of the town, a sanctuary where people came to confess, to worship, and to find comfort. But over time, its beauty began to fade. Attendance fell, scandals touched its leaders, and whispers of strange practices began to circulate. Then came the fire. In the mid-1970s, flames consumed a large part of the chapel during the night. Though no one could say for sure how it started, the damage was severe. The once sparkling windows shattered into pieces, the steeple bent under. The weight of smoke and ash, and the inside of the sanctuary became a ruin of blackened wood and crumbling stone. The fire alone would have been enough to close its doors, but there was more to the story, something that locals rarely spoke about directly. After the blaze, the chapel was abandoned, and nature began its slow work of reclaiming the property. Vines crept up the sides of the building, moss coated the roof tiles, and the grounds grew thick with weeds. At night, the air around the chapel felt colder than the rest of town. Children dared one another to run up the broken steps, but few ever made it past the threshold. Inside, the silence was heavy, the kind that seemed to press against the ears. People said they could hear faint echoes inside even when no one spoke. Some claimed the fire hadn't destroyed everything. It had left behind shadows that moved across the walls as though they had a life of their own. For years, the chapel stood untouched. Then, in the late 1990s, a wealthy man from out of town purchased the property. He told the press he wanted to restore it, to bring back its glory and turn it into a museum for history lovers and tourists. Many in town were relieved. Others were uneasy. But work began almost immediately, with construction crews hauling in equipment and supplies. For the first time in decades, the old chapel seemed alive with activity. That hope, however, was short-lived. Only a month after moving into the residence that had once served as the rectory, the new owner was found dead inside his bedroom. The coroner listed his cause of death as a sudden heart attack, but the details were strange. His face had been twisted in terror, his fists clenched so tightly that his fingernails had pierced his own palms. The workers who had been living in the house at the time left quickly afterward, abandoning their tools, their clothes, even their paychecks. Within a week, the project was over. The townspeople took notice. Rumors spread quickly, each story darker. Then the last. Some said the house was cursed, others that it was haunted by those who had perished in the fire. A few believed the wealthy man had uncovered something buried in its walls, something never meant to be found. The name St. Alora's Chapel was rarely spoken anymore. Instead, it became known by a new name, one whispered with both fear and fascination: the Holy House of Horror. Over time, the legend grew. Teenagers told stories of screams drifting from the broken windows. Drivers swore they saw lights flickering inside when the building had no electricity. And through it all, the house stood silent, its cracked steeple leaning like a warning to anyone who thought of stepping too close. The Holy House of Horror did not stay quiet for long. Years after the death of the wealthy man and the sudden flight of his workers, the mansion still loomed over the town like a scar. Its windows, broken and jagged, reflected no light, and its doors hung loose on rusted hinges. To the younger generation, it became more than a ruin. It was a challenge. Stories about the house circled through schools, told in hushed tones during sleepovers or whispered during late-night walks home. Everyone knew that something waited behind those heavy doors, but curiosity is a powerful force, and it always found victims. It was in the early 2000s when 3 college students, all studying art at the nearby university, decided the chapel would be the perfect subject for their final project. They were not thrill seekers or ghost hunters, just three ambitious girls who loved photography and wanted something striking to present to their class. The decaying chapel, with its history of fire and death, seemed to them like the ultimate backdrop. They arrived one spring afternoon with cameras hanging from their necks and tripods slung over their shoulders. Witnesses remembered seeing them laughing as they walked up the cracked stone path toward the towering doors, brushing aside the branches and weeds that had swallowed the entrance. That was the last time anyone saw them alive, when they failed. To return home that night, their families grew concerned. By the following morning, the police were called, and a search began. What investigators discovered unsettled even the most seasoned officers. The girls' belongings were still inside the chapel, scattered across the dusty floor near the altar. Their backpacks leaned neatly against the wall. Their phones were found, fully charged, and their car remained parked outside with the keys. In the ignition. The only thing missing were the girls themselves. The most disturbing discovery came when their cameras were collected. Each one still worked, and the memory cards were full. At first glance, the pictures seemed ordinary. Angles of the ruined pews, close-ups of shattered stained glass, sweeping shots of the vaulted ceilings. But as the photos progressed, something strange appeared. Dark shapes lingered in the background. Warped shadows that did not match the lighting in the room. A closer look revealed blurred outlines of figures, tall and distorted, standing at the edges of the frames. The last photos from each camera were almost identical, showing the altar from slightly different angles. But what caught everyone's attention was the reflection in the cracked glass of a framed painting behind it. Three girls were clearly visible in the reflection, yet behind them was another figure, taller, cloaked, and standing impossibly close. No one could explain how the figure appeared or why none of the girls seemed to notice it. Despite a thorough search, no trace of the students was found. Dogs brought into the building picked up a scent in the main sanctuary but lost it completely. Once they approached the altar, as if the trail ended at the very center of the chapel. In the weeks that followed, neighbors reported hearing strange sounds on Sunday evenings, the same time Mass had once been held decades earlier. Long, drawn out. Cries echoed across the fields, so faint it was impossible to tell if they were human or animal. But every account carried the same detail. The sound was always a woman's scream. The town grew uneasy, and the chapel became forbidden ground once again. Parents warned their children never to go near it, and even daring teenagers avoided its gates after nightfall. Police closed the investigation with little to show, filing the case as unresolved. Yet everyone knew the truth hung heavy in the air. The three girls had walked into the holy house of horror, and like so many before them, they had never walked back out. The building had taken them, swallowed them whole, and left only echoes to remind the living of what had happened within its walls. The tragedy of the missing girls should have been enough to keep the town away from the holy house of horror forever. But curiosity is a disease that spreads easily, and in time it reached the wrong person. A retired historian named Martin. Alcott had lived in the area his entire life. He had grown up hearing the stories about the chapel, listening to the tales of fire and whispers of curses. For years, he had dismissed them as small-town superstition, the sort of folklore that grows when people cannot explain the unexplainable. But when he heard about the missing students, his interest shifted from casual curiosity to obsession. He believed that the answers to what had happened were buried in history, and so he set out to find them. Martin began digging into church archives, sifting through boxes of old documents kept in the town hall basement. Many of the records were routine: birth certificates, baptism logs, donations from parishioners. But tucked away in a folder marked Special Services was something altogether different. The documents described events at St. Alora's that were never meant for public eyes. The chapel had not only served as a place of worship but as a secretive house of penance, where priests carried out private rituals on those accused of sins that could not be forgiven in the open. The writing was vague, full of coded language. But one detail appeared again and again: the word purified. In the margins of some reports, Martin found lists of names. Many of them belonged to children who had gone missing in the 1940s and 1950s, names long forgotten by the town but preserved in yellowed ink. Some names had check marks beside them, others had been crossed out. The deeper Martin went, the more disturbing the story became. He uncovered letters exchanged between priests that spoke of sacrifices, of offerings made to preserve the sanctity of the chapel. The language hinted at something beyond simple punishment, something ritualistic. In one particularly chilling note, a priest wrote that the walls of the chapel would hold the faithful until the final judgment. Martin could not ignore the implication. The missing children had not simply vanished. They had been taken, and their lives had ended beneath the chapel itself. Driven by this discovery, Martin pressed further. One brittle sheet of paper caught his attention more than the rest, a crude map sketched in fading ink. It showed the chapel's floor plan, but with details not visible to the public eye. Behind the altar was a stairway leading down into tunnels that spread like veins beneath the structure. At the center of the tunnels was a chamber, marked only with a cross. Martin realized that the sealed door behind the altar, one investigators had noted but never forced open, was no ordinary storage space. It was the gateway to something far more sinister. When police were presented with this information, a new search of the house was approved. Under bright lights and the watchful gaze of cameras, officers pried open the door and forced their way. Inside, what they discovered turned rumor into fact. The passage descended into a narrow tunnel where the air was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of rot. At the end of the tunnel was a chamber exactly as the map described. Its walls were rough stone, covered in names scratched by hand. Hundreds of them, carved deep, sometimes overlapping one another as if dozens of hands had worked endlessly to leave their mark. Chains hung from the walls, rusted and broken, and crude wooden crosses leaned against the corners, stained with something dark that no time could erase. Among the debris were personal objects, a shoe, a hair ribbon, fragments of clothing long decayed. Investigators matched some of the names carved into the walls with the missing children Martin had found in the records. The connection was undeniable. The chapel had been hiding a secret history of cruelty, its foundation soaked in suffering. The discovery left the town shaken. Everything they had whispered about for decades now stood in front of them, carved into stone and stained into wood. The Holy House of Horror was not just haunted by imagination, it was haunted by truth. The discovery of the underground chamber should have been the final chapter in the story of the Holy House of Horror. The town had confirmation of what it had long feared, that the chapel was built on suffering, its very stones holding the memory of pain and blood. The police sealed the site, and for a while, it seemed that the story might finally fade into silence. But in the modern age, silence never lasts long. News of the tunnels and the carving spread quickly, first through local newspapers and then across online forums where urban legends and ghost stories thrived. The Holy House became infamous beyond the boundaries of the town. And with fame came seekers, those who craved proof of the paranormal, those who wanted a thrill, and those who were willing to risk everything to capture it on camera. Urban explorers, armed with flashlights, video recorders, and streaming devices, began to flock to the site. The fence surrounding the property proved little obstacle, and soon the house that had once terrified locals became a stage for outsiders chasing notoriety. For a time, most returned with little more than shaky footage of dusty halls and whispers about unexplained noises. But then one group went further. They chose not only to film their exploration but to broadcast it live. Hundreds of viewers tuned in that night, watching from the safety of their homes as 4 young explorers entered the chapel. Their voices were low, their laughter nervous, but their steps carried them steadily toward the altar for nearly an hour. The stream showed the group moving through the building, their flashlights sweeping across the ruins. The feed caught close-ups of the warp-stained glass and the scorched ceiling beams. They narrated their exploration, pointing out the door behind the altar that had become the stuff of local legend. Then, to the thrill of their audience, they forced it open and descended into the tunnels. The video grew darker as their lights struggled to pierce the suffocating blackness. Viewers typed frantically in the chat, some warning the group to turn back, others urging them on. The explorers reached the underground chamber, and their cameras revealed the same chains and carvings the police had described. But then the mood shifted. The group's voices grew strained. Their lights flickered though their batteries were fresh. And in one chilling moment, the camera caught movement in the shadows at the far end of the chamber, standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and dressed in what appeared to be the tattered robes of a priest. It did not move, did not breathe, but stood as though it had been waiting all along. The explorers gasped, the camera shook, and for a split second, the figure's face seemed to reflect the light. It was not flesh but something sunken, hollow, more skull than skin. Before the audience could process what they had seen, the feed cut to black. The stream ended abruptly, and no one heard from the group again. The following morning, police entered the tunnels in search of the missing explorers. They expected to find equipment, perhaps signs of a panicked escape. Instead, they found nothing. No cameras, no bags, no footprints beyond the chamber itself. The dust that had been disturbed by the explorers' steps ended at the carved wall, as though they had walked straight into stone. Officers noted one detail that went largely unreported to the public. The names carved into the walls now included 4 new ones, etched crudely, as if written in haste. The names matched the missing explorers. The story spread faster than ever before. Forums filled with theories about what had happened. Some believed the figure was the ghost of a priest who had overseen the rituals decades ago. Others claimed it was no ghost at all, but a man who had lived beneath the chapel all these years, sustaining himself in the tunnels. Locals gave him a name, the Keeper. They believed he was bound to the house, guarding its secrets, taking anyone who dared to trespass on his sacred ground. The legend of the Holy House of Horror was no longer just about a cursed building. It was about something, or someone, still living within its depths, watching and waiting for the next soul to wander. Too close. The Holy House of Horror stood for decades as both a ruin and a warning. By the time the 21st century reached its second decade, the building was less a chapel and more a collapsing shell. Its roof sagged inward, its steeple leaned dangerously, and its foundation cracked with each passing season. Town officials debated what to do with it. Some argued for preservation, fearing that destroying the building would be seen as erasing history. Others wanted it gone, convinced that as long as it stood, it would continue to attract wanderers and leave more families grieving. The argument ended after yet another disappearance. A man from out of state, fascinated by the live stream that had ended in terror, came alone to the chapel. His car was later discovered parked on the roadside, its driver never found. That was the final straw. The town council voted unanimously to have the building torn down. The demolition was scheduled for early spring. Workers arrived with bulldozers and cranes, braced for resistance from locals who believed the house should remain untouched. But on the morning of the first strike, the streets were empty. Even those who had once fought to preserve the structure wanted nothing more to do with it. The crews began their work, metal teeth biting into the rotted wood and shattered stone. At first, the house seemed to fight back. The walls did not crumble as expected, but groaned and split slowly, as if refusing to yield. When the machinery struck the central foundation, the ground beneath them gave way. A massive sinkhole opened, swallowing part of the building and nearly taking the machines with it. Inside the hole lay the final secret of the Holy House. Investigators were called in as the demolition halted. What they uncovered was not just another chamber, but a burial ground. Layer upon layer of skeletal remains filled the earth, tangled together in grotesque knots. Skulls rested on rib cages, spines twisted unnaturally, as if the bodies had not been laid to rest but thrown carelessly into a pit. Many of the skeletons still wore fragments of clothing, rosaries, or crosses around their necks. Forensic experts estimated the remains numbered in the dozens, possibly more than 100. Some had been there for half a century, others more recent. It was clear now that the Holy House of Horror had not just been the site of rituals and punishments. It had been a graveyard, its foundation literally built on the dead amid the chaos of excavation, One coffin stood out from the mass of bones. Unlike the others, it was intact, made of polished wood, sealed tightly, and resting at the very center of the grave. Workers pried it open, expecting to find another skeleton. Instead, they discovered a body unnervingly well preserved. The figure wore decayed but recognizable priest's robes. His skin was waxen and pale, his features still sharp as though time had never touched him. But his hands told another story. The flesh had wasted away entirely, leaving behind skeletal claws, sharpened and yellow. Though tests were run, no one could determine how the body had remained in such a state. Even stranger, the records of the church contained no burial entry for the man. Officially, he had never died. The find reignited the legend of the keeper. Some believed the body was proof that the priest who had led the rituals still lingered, refusing to decay like the others. Others claimed the preservation was a sign that he had not truly been dead at all, only sleeping beneath the chapel while his spirit prowled its halls. Locals who had once called the chapel cursed now called it unholy ground. They demanded that the coffin never be moved, insisting that disturbing it further would release something the town could not control. But the coffin was removed for study. And soon after, strange events rippled through the area. Residents reported hearing faint hymns carried on the wind at night. Drivers passing the site said they saw lights flickering in the field where the house once stood. A few swore they heard voices calling their names from the dark. The demolition was completed and the land fenced off, but the story did not end with the rubble. The remains were buried in unmarked graves, and the coffin was locked away in a distant facility. Yet even now, decades later, no one dares to build on the land. To this day, the ground remains untouched, avoided even by hunters and hikers. At night, when the wind sweeps across the empty lot, people say you can hear the faint sound of a congregation singing, their voices echoing through the air as though the house itself still stands. The holy house of horror may have been reduced to ash and earth, but its legacy refuses to fade. It lingers, a scar on the town's history, a place where the line between the living and the dead was crossed too many times to ever heal.